Hi, here we are for the final fourth of the semester, right? We talk about this as the Augustan age in the 18th century. When last we left off, we were in the Restoration with Charles II coming back from France to sit on the throne. Charles was succeeded by his brother, James II, who was ultimately kicked out, for lack of a better expression, in what is termed the Glorious Revolution. As you recall, for a lot of this course, and especially since the time of the Tudors, we've had some very, very serious conflict in England over succession, right? The succession to the throne. And Catholic versus Protestant has been a theme for the last 2 months of this course, right? As we look at the writings since, again, the Tudors. The Glorious Revolution tossed James, who was a Catholic, off the throne. He was replaced by his own daughter, who is Protestant, and her husband, and William and Mary. And what this did is, for most intents, it ended the line of Catholicism as an active threat. Now, there were still, for generations afterwards, claims of the Stuarts coming back to the throne. Robert Louis Stevenson actually talks about that in some of his works, if you're interested in that. But the idea of the return of the Stuarts, while it had an appeal to some of the people, for the most part, and for our purposes, especially from the literature standpoint, it's done. And what succeeds really, is a sequence in which the succession is not really in turmoil, right? It does pass eventually to the Georges, the Hanoverian kings, but really there's a stability. And that's what I want to emphasize. There is a stability here. Okay. Now, we left off our last section with Dryden in Congreve, right? Dryden, as I said, was associated with Charles II and James II. Congreve is a younger man. In this section, we see Aphra Behn, and she is kind of a difficult figure in the chronology, because she's more associated with Congreve's generation than the later generation that we're going to be talking about. But what she deals with, for instance, these issues of colonialism, essentially, right? As England is growing bigger and bigger and bigger, its power is not just limited to, for instance, the colonies that we know of on the eastern seaboard that we now call the United States, or further north, Canada. But England is expanding its power into Africa and Asia as well, creating colonies all around the world. It is slowly but surely becoming the most dominant nation on the planet. It does have some conflict with France, which provides, of course, opportunities. But by and large, it's getting pretty clear that England is number one, right, on the planet in this time period. And so we call this period, first of all, the Augustan age, because the writers, particularly those active in the earliest part of the 18th century, kind of seeping back maybe a little bit in time, writers like Jonathan Swift, Joseph Addison, Alexander Pope, and these people saw themselves and their nation in the same position as the Roman Empire at its peak under Caesar Augustus. Okay, So they related, if you will, to the Romans. And they obviously privileged the learning of Latin as well as ancient Greek. We saw a little bit of this with Dryden in terms of his making some money near the end of his life by translating, right, ancient manuscripts. But this just signals to us essentially that this is a dominant thought amongst the intellectuals and writers of this time to kind of connect to the Romans. And so writers like Ovid, Horace, and the epic poet Virgil become not just somebody to read, but somebody to model. And they modeled their poetry after Roman poetry in terms of both style and content. Okay. Now, as we go later into the century, into the 18th century, these folks, the Swift and Pope, right, as they kind of near their end, they're replaced by the towering figure of Dr. Samuel Johnson. Okay, Sam Johnson is of a younger generation than those people, and maybe about 2 generations, 3 generations, maybe younger than Aphra Behn, who is, dies 20 years before Johnson's even alive. But Johnson kind of takes the mantle of the middle part of this century. Now, the end of the century, that's the Romantics, and you'll study those in English 216, right? Because they are influenced by the Age of Revolution, the American Revolution, and later the French Revolution. But Johnson is kind of an unapologetic, almost jingoistic English writer. Okay. And some of the concerns, though, are still very valid and very similar to the concerns earlier in the century. There is still a heavy emphasis on satire, right? We saw satire with Dryden, Congreve before, right? But Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift is a satire. Alexander Pope, Rape of the Lock is a satire. His essay on man has some satirical elements to it as well, as it kind of looks to how people behave, that sort of thing. And when we get to Johnson's Rasselas, it's clearly a satire also, right? Both in terms of form and content. So that's something to keep in mind. One of the other things that we're starting to see is what you might call the rise of the professional writer, of which Johnson is a great culmination. And by the professional writer, I'm talking about the person who does not have a patron, right? Does not have somebody who is basically, a noble or even the monarch, who makes sure that they have plenty of money to live on as long as they produce written work on, certain occasions. I'm talking about the pros, P-R-O, pro, right? The professionals. We start seeing this, Aphra Behn, for example. One of the reasons that she's an important writer is because of this, well, quite frankly, money-making ability, right? We saw Dryden, who loses his position as poet laureate and eventually turns and writes again, for money, his translations of Virgil, for example. The play, like Congreve, right, our playwrights have always been professional in that respect. We look at Marlowe and Shakespeare for obvious examples. They were writing plays for money. But in terms of writing poetry or other sorts of works, this is only now just sort of becoming part of it. And what happens also, though, is you start to see a little separation with the rise of literacy. So England's becoming more powerful. There's more political stability. What do you see? People are rising up. And there's greater and greater rates of literacy. People can read. and they want to read. But not everybody wants to read translations of Virgil or Homer. And so you're starting to see class distinctions coming into literature in a way that we didn't really see them before. Okay. There is a section of London, just an area, called Grub Street. Okay, and Grub Street becomes known as the place where penny novels are sold. Okay. We saw a little bit of this in John Dryden, right? Where he's talking about, the Grub Street writers in Macflecknoe. And he, of course, is looking down his nose at them, right? He's looking down his nose. And other writers, like R. Swift and Pope, again, kind of very highly educated. And even though, for instance, in Swift, you see a lot of scatological imagery, and you see a lot of, you might suggest kind of little, kind of lower class sort of elements to it. That's a little different than what's going on with the professional writers who are churning out what we would nowadays call pulp fiction, right? Churning out penny novels for money. And the patron saint, if you will, of Grub Street is Samuel Johnson, for instance, who wrote Rasselas in order to pay for his mother's funeral expenses. Okay. This is not somebody sitting back on the hilltop contemplating their navel, thinking of all the great themes of life and how to present them best in iambic pentameter. This is somebody who is churning it out. In fact, one of the interesting things about Dr. Johnson is that he did eventually get a pension, we'll call it. The Crown eventually was so impressed after so long that it gave him regular money, because Johnson had always had such money problems, and he was such a great writer, but he never really made enough money to be comfortable. Let's just put it that way. And he stopped writing. He stopped writing after he got this pension. And people asked him why he stopped writing. He said he only wrote for money. And only a blockhead ever wrote for anything else. Yeah, take that to your creative writing classes. Only a blockhead ever wrote for anything else. Yeah, the romantics are going to come and turn that around again, right? As these things always happen. The last writer of our semester is significantly younger than anybody else. James Boswell, born in 1740, right? He's kind of like the little puppy who followed Johnson around when Johnson was famous, and became famous, even more famous, because of Boswell, who basically was his biographer. And this was unusual at the time, because usually you write biographies of people who are dead, right? Well, at least in those days. But Boswell followed Johnson around, they were friends. And his great topic was going to be Johnson's life, which ironically, or not ironically, the final work that he produced was called The Life of Johnson, right? Which is enormously successful commercially work. And he records basically Johnson's life, his sayings, because Johnson was known as a great conversationalist, and the things that he would say at dinners, right? And that's the way that the book preserves Johnson in the collective memory as a guy whose witty sayings were written down by